sugar and cream. Thanks for the privilege of sharing with you this morning. It just struck me as we were praying that sometimes the sermon has already happened by the time it starts, and that'll make sense to you once you share these reflections. But I trust that I can just kind of reiterate and highlight some of the things that we've already experienced this morning, and that I love the way God does that. Kind of speaks already before the preacher gets up. So, as Dave mentioned, this is the last of the series around Elijah and Elisha, and I was given the simple topic of healing. Dave's a smart guy, you know, like he'll take sustainer and provider, and he'll give Dave bolster healing. So we're traveling through that same time period. If you want to throw up that map there, I want to just give you a bit of context around this story and where we are. So this was the biblical map that I could find of this era. We have a couple key characters, some key leaders, and I want to just place them on this visual so that you have a sense, because as stories go, there's characters, there's a plot, there's action, there's things that happen, but it's in a different time, right? This is around 9th century BC, so just think thousands of years ago, and you'll be onto it. This is 2 Kings chapter 5, and there's this moment in history here. I'll see if I'm going to just grab this mic and point at the map a little bit for you. Yeah, so we have a couple, just three or four main characters. So we have the northern kingdom. You see the word Israel here. So it's at a time where we have the Jewish people. They're in two groups, in the south and in the north. So we have Judah and Israel. So in each of these regions had a king. So there was a powerful leader in each of these regions. So one of the people that is mentioned is the king of Israel, who is Joram. And you may not know Joram, but he's the son of King Ahab and Queen Jezebel. Those might be familiar terms to you. And he was known as a wicked king. So not a super nice guy, Joram. And he was a devout Baal worshiper. And David talked about Baal a couple of weeks ago when on Mount Carmel there was this big standoff between Elijah and the prophets of Baal. So this King Joram, he's connected to that kind of worship, all right? So that's the Jewish people living there. Now, if you go north of that, we have Aram, way up north, which is also called Syria. And you may be familiar with the name Damascus, which is still a city today. They also have a king, and his name was Ben-Hadad II. And he was very powerful, a very wealthy kingdom, and this border between Israel and Syria was a contested border. When you hear the story today, you will feel as though we're talking about things that happened in our day. We still live in a world of contested borders. And there would be soldiers from Syria that would raid villages in Israel. And that's the context of 2 Kings 5, where we have this contested border and skirmishes happening along this border. If you want to just zoom out there, Dave. So, where does Elisha show up? He's the prophet of Israel, so in the north there, and he grew up west of the Jordan River between the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea, kind of right in here. So you can see there that red line, okay, so Naaman, who's our fourth character, he's the high commander in Aram's army, in Syria's army. He's the highest military commander. So he's from way up north there by Damascus. And the story you're going to hear, he travels from Damascus all the way down to Israel, to Samaria, which was the capital, to meet Elisha. When he gets to Samaria, they send him down to around Gilgal, and that's where Elisha's home is. And then one other thing you got to notice here. You see this little river here connecting the Sea of Galilee? That's the Jordan River. Then if you go way back up to the top to Syria, you've got Abana and Pharpar rivers. So just to know that people felt deeply about their rivers in this era. The Syrians thought their rivers were awesome. Huge, beautiful rivers. And then there's the little Jordan River, which actually isn't very deep. It's probably smaller than the Red River. You know, like how we feel. We feel like the Red River is just this awesome river compared to anything you'd find in Alberta or BC, right? Like, ours is crystal clear, gorgeous, beautiful, amazing, right? The power is in the Red River. We all know that. Okay, so now you have the characters. You've got Joram of Israel, you've got Ben-Hadad up north, you've got Ben-Hadad's right-hand military leader, Naaman, and you have Elisha. So, Catherine's going to come and tell this story out of 2 Kings 5. When Dave sent me this 2 Kings, the first thing that came to mind was, I've heard this story somewhere before. Turns out my wife has written a version of this story many years ago with a team that traveled across Canada called Connecting Points with Kids. What they would do is bring families together, children and adults, and they would have them experience biblical stories. And this was one of the stories that they worked with. And they had a cartoonist, they had a radio producer, and they had families hear the story while a cartoonist was drawing it, and then they recorded the sound effects of the story together, and eventually created a whole CD out of these biblical stories. Catherine was the storyteller of that team. And so rather than reading the NIV version of the story, we're going to hear Catherine tell the story out of CPK, Connecting Points with Kids. Listen for the lead, one of the characters, the servant girl in this story. All right, here we go.
The servant girl's secret. It was a sunny day in our village. Hannah and I had gone with our mom to the market. As Mom bought fruit and bread, we began a game of hide and seek. Hannah counted while I slipped through the crowds to the edge of the village square. I crouched behind some old baskets. Hannah would never find me. As I rested my chin on my knees, doubt tugged at my heart. Mom would not be pleased with our game. She had reminded us to stay close to her because bands of Syrian soldiers had been terrorizing Israeli villages. I should have obeyed my mother's warning. A distant shout broke through my thoughts. I turned and froze. Silhouetted against the sun were the dark figures of horses and chariots standing at the top of the ridge above me. A chill ran down my spine. Syrians. I watched in horror as the raiders thundered down the hill and into the market. I turned to run, but there was no escape. Dust and the pounding hooves of the horses engulfed me. Terrible shouts and screams of panicked men and women surrounded me. Swords flashed in the sunlight while the hot smell of smoke and the black crackle of fire filled the air. "Hannah! Mom!" I screamed. A rough hand grabbed me by the arm and threw me onto the horse. "No!" I awoke with a start. My sweat-soaked shirt clung to my arms. Where was I? Everything was different. I breathed deeply as I tried to regain my senses. The unbelievable had happened, and now I was a captive far from my home. The Syrians had divided up the spoils of my village and had given me to Naaman, commander of the army. I had to work from morning to night. day after day, carrying water pots, sweeping the floors, or doing whatever my mistress commanded. I was never allowed to rest or play. It was obvious that the Master Naaman was a famous hero. Everyone bowed low when he came into the room. The king greatly admired Naaman because he had led the Syrian army to glorious victories in the war with Israel. Legend had it that Naaman had killed the king of Israel with an arrow to the heart. Although Naaman was a handsome, mighty warrior, he was very sick. He suffered from a horrible, incurable skin disease called leprosy. Parts of the skin on Naaman's face, hands, and feet had turned white. He took medicines and ate strange foods. He even visited doctors and magicians, but nothing helped. It was only a matter of time before his nose, fingers, and toes would fall off. Eventually, he would die, blind and disfigured. Often while I worked, I let my mind wander. I liked to imagine my old house and my family. I tried to picture Hannah's long black hair, or imagine the taste of the delicious suppers my mom used to make. And when I couldn't sleep, I would recall the bedtime stories my dad had told me. That's when I remembered a story about Elisha, a prophet of God. Elisha, our Israelite hero. He was famous for performing miracles. Once, God had used Elisha to bring a dead boy back to life. This was my secret. I knew that Naaman could be healed if he would go see God's prophet Elisha. But I didn't want to help him. I was afraid to suggest anything to my mistress. I might be punished for speaking without being asked, and besides, it was Naaman's army that had torn me from my family. So I decided to keep the secret to myself. As the months and weeks dragged by, I worked and worked and worked, and my routine never changed, and I could not stop thinking about my secret. Every time I saw Master Naaman, the thought tugged at my heart. Maybe I should tell him about Elisha. One day, I could hold it no longer. I decided to tell my mistress. I wish my master would go see the prophet Elisha. I know he could heal Naaman of leprosy. To my surprise, the mistress told Naaman about my secret. Then Naaman told the king, and the king agreed with my wish and didn't hesitate to send Naaman on the long journey to visit Elisha. It took a whole host of horses and servants to carry along the gifts of gold and silver and a special letter of introduction to give to the king of Israel. I never imagined my secret would create such a fuss. As Naaman entered the king of Israel's court to present his request, the officials and attendants backed away in horror. They stared at the bandages that wrapped Naaman's hands and feet. The disease was ugly. No one wanted to go near. By nightfall, the news of Naaman's visit had spread like wildfire throughout the city. The next morning, a messenger arrived at the palace. He was brought before the king and said this: "Elisha, the man of God, sends you this message. Send Naaman to me, and he will learn that there is a true prophet of God here in Israel." The clatter of hooves echoed in the cobblestone streets as Naaman and his company drew to a halt at Elisha's house. Onlookers poked their heads out windows. What was this strange commotion? One of Naaman's servants knocked at Elisha's door. Naaman expected to meet Elisha and then present his request. The servants knocked again and waited some more. Why would no one answer? After a long time, the door creaked open, and a man stood in the entrance. He said, "Master Elisha has this message for Naaman. Go, wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan River. If you do this, you will be healed of the leprosy." Well, Naaman was furious. Elisha had not come out to greet him. Is it too much to have this so-called prophet of God pray, wave his hand over my body and cure me? His bandages unraveled slightly as he shook an angry fist. If it's rivers I need to get rid of my leprosy, I'll go wash at home. Naaman's servants tried to reason with him. Master, if the prophet had told you to do some great thing, wouldn't you have done it? So you should certainly obey him when he simply says go wash and be cured. Why not try it at least? The whole lot watched silently as Naaman paced back and forth. He kicked a stone with his bandaged foot, then turned and replied, "Let's go to the Jordan." It was mid-afternoon when they arrived at the banks of the Jordan River. Naaman removed his outer robes at the edge of the gently flowing creek. He unwrapped the bandages from his hands and feet. Mud oozed between his toes as he slowly waded in. He lowered his body and head under the murky waters. Naaman took a deep breath when he surfaced. Water splashed around him as Naaman trudged back to the shore. He did the same thing again. One of the officers kept count as Naaman washed himself a 3rd, a 4th, then a 5th time. The servants strained to see if Naaman's wounds and hands and face were beginning to heal. "Once more," said Naaman as he came out of the water again. He had washed 6 times. The servants fidgeted nervously. No one dared speak. This was the 7th and final time. Would Naaman come out healed? Or had Elisha played a cruel joke? Naaman rose from the river. He blinked and wiped drops of water from his eyes and face. He stretched out his hands. Could it be true? He ran toward the shore, sprayed everyone. Naaman looked down at his muddy feet and wiggled his healthy toes. He shouted for joy as his servants cheered and clapped. His skin was smooth and clean like that of a young boy. The leprosy was gone. When Naaman returned home, healthy and strong, some people thought that Elisha was a magician. Others assumed that the Jordan River had mysterious healing powers. But my master and I, we shared a secret. We both knew that there was only one true God, a God of great power and love. Naaman and I, a little Jewish slave girl, worshipped the same God.
Thank you, Catherine. Can you hear the sound effects? They used a mop in a bucket for the water when you come out. It actually sounds exactly like the Jordan River when you do that. It's lots of fun. That's a profound and powerful story. I want to give you a couple questions just to think about out of this scene, and then a few reflections on where it took me, where this story took me in relation to healing. If you think about the servant girl and what it would have felt like to be captured and taken away, what emotion would she have been carrying? Yeah. Or if you think about some of the words that you would use to describe this servant girl, do you think jumping into a river would heal? If you've seen someone sick for a long time, what do you wish for them? And if the servant girl did meet Naaman when he got back, what do you think their conversation would have been like?
That Naaman found favor in that little girl.
Would have been a wonderful scene, wouldn't it? To see those two together in some way.
Maybe he adopted her, probably.
I want to take you to 3 places in the story. If you want to throw up that first one there. First theme, healing comes through little people. Now you see that phrase there, the story of the bands of raiders coming from Aram, from Syria, and they had taken a young girl captive. Now if you look at that word, I looked up the word young to say, what is that referring to? And if you look at the original language in Hebrew, the other words attached to that are little or insignificant or small or unimportant. And it got me thinking about the characters in this story that brought Naaman to the river, the ones that prompted these life-giving decisions in someone else. So we have the servant girl, insignificant in some ways in this powerful household of this commander. You have the mistress, you have the king, but then look at all of the servants. If you just look at the servants in this story, you have Elisha's servant who comes to the door. You have Naaman's servants who kind of prod and try to convince him to think again, right? Like, are these the powerful people in the story who are kind of moving this person closer to the presence of God? It's amazing how our words can have power to nudge someone closer to God. Proverbs says, reckless words pierce like a sword, but the tongue of the wise brings healing. And it struck me that God puts little people, you can think of all the different forms of that word, into his life-giving stories. So I was imagining, this is where this took me. So what if God was imagining that, God wanted to do something in downtown Winnipeg? Let's say about 10 years ago, and it goes something like this, because the Winnipeg street census that just happened, the 2022 version said there's 1,256 people experiencing homelessness. So what if God cared about that? So God's like, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to get a 100-year-old building with some mice in it. We're going to drop in one shower, a couple washers. We're going to get 2 eccentric staff, but both with a sense of humor. You notice I didn't name any names. And we're gonna say that there's like 30 people maximum in this room, in a meeting room. We're gonna get a handful of volunteers, and then God says, go. Would you consider 188 little when you look up and down the street?
Yeah.
But how do you know that it matters? I listened to a very interesting conversation at our leadership meetings a couple of weekends ago. We were asking, what's different about 188? What would people notice? And the word that came up was expectations, that there's expectations for each other in how we treat each other. What do we mean by that? Well, that you matter, that I matter, and because of that, then our actions between each other matter. So when you walk into this space, you matter. And we try to figure out how to do that in a lot of different ways. There's relationship at the core. And that's kind of a little taste of life with purpose. The other way that I know that little 188 matters is when we walk down the street and Percy was telling us some of his life story at these very street corners. And as I looked around, all these people on every block of this area were stopping and talking to someone in the group. They recognized all these people. If you're feeling small, I think this story tells us, don't write off the little people. Second theme, healing is more than a cure. So Elisha sent a messenger to say to him, go wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan and your flesh will be restored. And then what's Naaman's reaction? What's his reaction? Naaman went away angry and said, I thought he would surely come out to me and stand and call in the name of the Lord. And I love that scene, right? And he'd wave his hands over the spot and cure me of my leprosy. Are not Abana and Parphar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of the Red River, of Israel? Couldn't I wash in them and be cleansed? And he turned and went off in a rage. What's going on here? Brian Jones, a biblical scholar, describes this scene this way. Naaman literally was bringing 1,000 pounds of silver and 150 pounds of gold and 10 suits of clothing. This huge treasure. And he comes with this entourage of horses and chariots, this procession of power. And he rolls up in front of Elisha's house that afternoon, horses tossing their heads, chariots gleaming, boxes of silver and gold, and wait for it, ready to buy a cure. Yes, that's it. Naaman was coming with his view of his gods. Elisha, instead, sends Naaman off to take a self-serve, third-rate river cure. It's outrageous. So what's being healed in this scene? What's being healed? Well, Naaman is confronting his soul, not just his body. He's confronting his belief in power, in prestige, in status, in self-confidence, and his notion of who God is. Like the other gods of the day, like Baal, you buy an incantation. Healing is magic. It's a formula. You appease and please the gods, they'll do something for you. And here you've been on a journey with someone. I'm wondering, have you been on a journey like this? Where somebody's sick, and either they or you or someone close to them is healed, even though no one finds a cure. Think about that. Because I've seen that. We have this, I think it's a tradition by now in our family, that when we have birthdays, and this was prompted by one of my children that happens to be here this morning, that you go around and you say something about the birthday child. Right? Just kind of a random, say something. Typically, it's supposed to be nice. So, a couple of years ago, I had a heart attack. And the doctors successfully put a couple stents in my heart to get the blood flowing. And in that rehab process, one day I was at this physical rehab program, and so one of the people came up to me and said, would you like to see a psychologist? Now, what comes to mind when somebody walks up to you and says, would you like to see a psychologist? Kind of like a suggestion, maybe, right? What are they seeing here? Well, long story short, that was an incredible conversation, and many that followed. And at my birthday in January, this past January, here's how I know that there was some healing beyond a cure. Because one of the comments in that circle was, I like this version of Dad. Can you hear it? How can we tell that Naaman was remade? The end of the story, Naaman keeps offering these gifts now out of gratitude. And he says, okay, please let me, and he names himself now as, please let me, your servant, be given, get this, this is hilarious, be given as much earth as a pair of mules can carry, for your servant will never again make burnt offerings and sacrifices to any other god but the Lord. What's he doing, right? He is now looking at the soil that he had scorned on the riverbank, and now he saw it as holy ground, and he wanted to he literally filled as much baskets of soil on his mules that he could take back so that he could just have a taste of that holy ground and worship the true God. So we have this grand reversal, not only of his body, but also of his soul. Healing, often I suggest, is more than a cure. And finally, healing is complex. Dave wasn't sure if it was. I think it is. Healing is complex. Pray anyway. I was having a conversation with my mom the other day because she's always curious about what I'm doing. She's 97, almost 98 in January. And she said, what's your sermon about? I said, well, it's about the healing of Naaman. And I asked her, I said, do you have any insights into how to think about healing when we pray for someone who isn't getting well? And she paused a little bit, and then she said, that's a tricky question. That's a tricky question. Indeed it is. And particularly tricky because when I was asking the question, I was sitting in a chair beside her hospital bed at Concordia Hospital, where she's been lying for the last 2 weeks. There's a scholar, Edmund Jacobs, who suggests that in the Old Testament, there's one thing that differentiates the Israelites from the people, their neighbors who were Baal worshiping, and that is that they believed, their view of God, that their God was the living God. That life is what differentiates Yahweh from the other gods. So if you think about that scene at Mount Carmel, what did they say about Baal? Maybe he's sleeping, right? Maybe he's not here. So the prophets at Mount Carmel go crazy, right? Trying to arouse their God. But the servant girl, she simply believes that her God is the living God, that this is where life comes from. So here's my humble suggestion. Pray anyway. But here's the thing. Sometimes we pray a request that seems to make complete sense as to what would be good. And God calls. We answer. Sometimes it seems like God calls, and other times we see the visible absence of God. Have you felt that? The visible absence of God. This is a good time, the where are you prayer. What do we do with those? This makes total sense to me. This would be good, but you don't seem to be answering. The servant girl exercised her trust in God, not as a magic formula, but as a relationship with the living God. That's impressive and that's courageous. One last story. There's a pastor in Saskatchewan who took a year's worth of a church's prayers during their community prayer time like we just had, and he categorized them. What do you think was the main category? God's impatient. He really wants to get through to Louis. What do you think was the main category of the petitions of that congregation? One of the friends of this guy called it, these prayers, an organ recital. In other words, 2/3 of the petitions were hip bones and cancer and deaths. And there's even a song that goes, that's written about this. The leg bone connected to the knee bone connected to the thigh bone, right? These are our prayers. Now Josh, this pastor, says there's nothing wrong with these physical healing requests, but he's noticed a trend that in the early church, people believed that through the power of Jesus' cross and the outpouring of the Spirit, that these prayers would change the world. But we've started to pray a little differently. we pray an inward prayer. God, please sustain this individual. Give them peace of mind. Give them faithfulness during their suffering. So when we pray, we don't risk being tempted to look out the window to see if the world has changed. It's like, can I be at peace maybe with what's happening? So Josh suggests maybe we should pray more boldly. Not that prayer for peace or sustaining in suffering is inappropriate. What did the servant girl say? If only my master would see the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of leprosy. So why can we join her? Why do I say we can pray more boldly? Because if healing isn't magic, if it's not about controlling the outcome, then prayer becomes this profound relational moment between me and God. So why not then have a very intense conversation with God about what's outside your window? That's the invitation. So finally, healing comes through little people. That's what I'm thinking. Go to that last slide. Healing comes through little people. You matter. Healing is more than a cure, and healing is complex, so pray anyway. And then the invitation is, go look out the window.